You are not walking into that church. My father's hand came down against the chapel doors so hard the stained glass in the small window beside them shook in its frame. Every conversation on the steps outside went quiet at the same moment. My aunt froze halfway up the stone path. The funeral director looked down at his shoes like the ground had suddenly become very interesting. Then my father turned and pointed directly at me. In front of all of them. In front of neighbors and relatives and people I had grown up around. People who had watched me come and go from this family my entire life. After what you did to your mother, he said, you don't belong at her funeral. The rain was soaking through my coat. I hadn't even noticed until that moment, standing on those steps with my chest caving in, realizing that my mother's casket was 10 feet away on the other side of those doors and two men in dark suits were positioning themselves between me and the entrance like I was a threat. My half-sister Avery stood behind my father clutching tissues. She was looking slightly to the left of my face. Not at me. Through me. What did I do? I whispered. He ignored me completely. The doors opened behind him long enough for me to hear organ music drifting out. Then he stepped inside and the doors closed. My name is Natalie Mercer. I'm 28 years old. And I had no idea that morning that my mother's funeral was the beginning of a war she had secretly prepared me to win. I was still standing on those steps when an elderly woman touched my hand. She moved quickly and quietly, the way small people sometimes move in crowded spaces, and she was gone before I fully registered what she had done. I looked down at my palm and found a small brass key sitting there, worn smooth at the edges, attached to a faded cardboard tag with 3 handwritten words in ink that had bled slightly at the edges. For Natalie only. I looked up. She was already halfway across the car park. I called out and went after her, pushing past 2 relatives who were still watching me with that uncomfortable mixture of pity and distance. By the time I reached the end of the path, she had disappeared into a line of parked cars and the gray morning swallowed her completely. I went back to my own car. Inside, I sat with the key in both hands while the rain hit the windscreen and muffled organ music moved through the stone walls of the church. My phone buzzed. Text from Avery. Mom deserved peace. Please stop making this harder. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. For 8 months I had quietly paid part of my mother's treatment bills while Avery posted brunch photos, and my father visited the hospital mainly when other people were around to notice. And somehow I was the one making things harder. I turned the key over in my fingers the whole drive home. Near the base, barely visible, was a small engraving. 2 words. Union Safe Deposit. I skipped the burial the next morning. I couldn't stand beside that grave and pretend to be welcome when the previous day was still so fresh. I drove downtown instead to Union Trust Bank, with swollen eyes and no real expectation of what I would find. The branch manager's expression changed the moment he saw the key. He looked at it, then at me, then asked me to confirm my name. When I told him, he said the words carefully. Miss Mercer. We were instructed to release the contents only upon confirmation of your mother's passing. He led me to a private room. The safe deposit box was small and rectangular. Inside were 3 things. A sealed envelope, flash drive, and a handwritten note in my mother's handwriting, the delicate sloped cursive I had known since childhood. If your father kept you away from me at the end, it means I was right. I pressed both hands over my mouth and sat there for a long time, because suddenly all the small strange things from the previous months came back in a rush. The whispered phone calls when she thought I wasn't close enough to hear. The way she would grip my hand too tightly sometimes when we sat together. The question she asked me twice in the last few weeks. Do you trust anyone else in this family? I opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was an invitation to the will reading scheduled for the following morning. And 1 sentence, underlined twice in ink. Do not let them intimidate you this time. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop that night at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I never drank going cold beside me. I expected documents, bills maybe, or records of some kind. Instead, the first folder I opened was labeled audio. Inside were dozens of files named by date. Clicked the oldest one. My mother's voice came through the speakers and she was crying. Not loudly. The contained kind of crying you do when you're trying to stay quiet. Natalie can never know what he did. I pulled my hands off the keyboard. The recording was dated 4 months before she died. Then my father's voice followed. Cold and impatient in the way I had heard 100 times at the family dinner table, when someone had said something that inconvenienced him. "You're overreacting. She'll get her share when I decide she deserves it." Then my mother's response. And this was the sentence that changed the entire shape of the evening for me. "If you shut her out after I'm gone, I swear I buried everything where she'll find it." The recording ended there. I sat in the dark for almost an hour replaying those words. Buried everything. What did she mean? What had he done that she knew about and had hidden from me? Why did she sound frightened of her own husband? Then I saw another folder near the bottom of the drive. Property transfer. Confidential. The document showed my father quietly moving assets into Avery's name while my mother was still in hospice care. Still alive. Still fighting. The solicitor's office the following morning had the particular tension of a room full of people who all know something is about to go wrong but are waiting to find out how. My father arrived before me. He didn't look at me when I walked in. Avery did. She was sitting beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and a small composed expression that I had learned over the years meant she was performing calm rather than feeling it. That expression changed the moment the attorney cleared his throat and announced there was an additional conditional directive attached to the will. Conditional. My father's voice was sharp. The attorney adjusted his glasses and said the words deliberately. "Yes. Mrs. Mercer requested this section be activated only in the event that Natalie Mercer was excluded from funeral proceedings." The room went very still. I watched the color change in my father's face, starting at his collar and moving upward. The attorney turned his laptop screen toward the room and pressed play on a video file. My mother appeared on screen. She was thin from the chemotherapy and her hair was gone, but her eyes were completely clear. "If you are watching this," she said, looking directly at the camera, "then my husband proved me right." Avery started crying immediately. My father stood up. "Turn this off." The attorney did not turn it off. My mother looked into the camera again and said the words that made the air in the room feel entirely different. "The lake house belongs solely to Natalie now." My father completely lost his composure. "She manipulated you," he said to the attorney, loud enough that I could hear the slight shake underneath the volume. "Natalie poisoned her against this family. I want this challenged. This is not valid." The attorney kept reading. My mother had left Avery a modest trust fund. My father received almost nothing directly from her estate. The bulk of her private investments, property rights, and full decision-making authority over her charitable foundation had been designated to me. Then the attorney read the final condition, and my father stopped mid-sentence. "Any attempt to contest this shall trigger release of supplementary documents to designated parties." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. Earlier the room had been surprised. Now it was afraid. My father sat back down slowly. His hands were pressing flat against his thighs. Not anger now. Something underneath anger. Real fear. As people gathered their things to leave, my father grabbed my arm hard enough that I felt it above the elbow. "You have no idea what your mother was really like," he said very quietly. Pulled my arm free. "Maybe neither did you." Behind me, Avery moved past and whispered something that made my stomach drop. "You should have just stayed away like Mom wanted." I turned to ask her what she meant, but she was already through the door. And something about the way she said it, the confidence in it, told me she knew more than she was pretending. I drove to the lake house that evening by myself. The place smelled exactly the way it always had. Cinnamon candles and old books and the particular cold that settles into wooden houses near water. I barely made it past the front door before I had to sit down on the floor against the wall and simply cry until there was nothing left. When I finally stood, I noticed something I hadn't when I walked in. The floorboard near the fireplace had faint scratch marks around its edges. Clean lines, as though something had been lifted and replaced many times. I pressed it at one corner and it shifted. Underneath was a shallow space, and inside that space was a wooden box with a small metal clasp. 6 journals. My mother's handwriting on the cover of each one, dated by year. I opened the oldest and read the first entry, and it broke something open in my chest. Walter has spent years convincing the girls that Natalie is selfish. I don't know how to stop him anymore. Page after page after page. A decade of careful observation recorded in her sloped cursive. My father isolating her financially after his business failed. Controlling conversations. Twisting the accounts of things that had happened until everyone in the family carried a slightly wrong version of the truth. Turning Avery against me gradually. The way you turn a dial a small amount each day so no one notices the shift. Then one entry near the back of the 3rd journal. I found the missing money. The missing money wasn't an abstract sum. It was my college fund. $20,000 that disappeared when I was 19 years old. The year I had to withdraw from university and work double shifts at a hotel and a coffee shop simultaneously for 11 months while my father explained that the market had performed badly and sometimes these things happened. My mother's journal entry was precise. The money had not been lost in any market. My father had transferred it. The account it went into was in Avery's name. I sat on the floor of the lake house holding that journal with my hands pressed tight together to stop the shaking. Not because of the money. I had rebuilt. I had found my own way through that year and the years after it. But Avery had cried with me when it happened. She had sat beside me while I packed up my student room and told me she was so sorry, that it was so unfair, that she couldn't believe it. She had held my hand on the train home. She had known the entire time. Every memory of her comfort that year reordered itself into something else entirely. My phone rang. My father. I almost didn't pick up. But I did, and his first sentence confirmed something I had been sensing all day. You need to stop digging before you ruin this family permanently. Not explaining. Not defending. Just warning. The following morning, someone knocked on the lake house door. Mrs. Callahan lived 3 properties down along the lake path. She was in her 70s and had known my mother for almost 20 years. She stood on the front step looking nervous in the particular way of someone who has been carrying a decision for a while and has finally made it. She handed me an envelope without much preamble. Inside were photographs. Printed, not digital. The kind someone had taken deliberately and stored carefully. My father entering hotels and restaurants with a woman I didn't immediately recognize. Different locations. Different seasons. Years of images with dates written on the backs in handwriting that was not my mother's. Mrs. Callahan told me my mother had found out about the affair shortly after her cancer diagnosis. She had stayed quiet because she was frightened of what he would do financially if she pushed him out. She had calculated that leaving would cost her access to resources she needed for treatment. You were the only thing keeping her strong, Mrs. Callahan said. She said your voice on the phone was the only part of the day she didn't have to manage. After she left, I turned over one of the photographs. My mother had written on the back. She can never know who he really is until I'm gone. I turned to the photograph itself and looked properly at the woman's face. My stomach turned completely over. The woman was Aunt Elise. My mother's own cousin. The one who sat at our holiday table and complained about traffic and brought wine that nobody enjoyed and hugged my mother at every gathering with the particular warmth of someone performing closeness for an audience. I sat with that knowledge for a full hour before I could move. Every holiday. Every family dinner. Every occasion where Elise had reached across the table and put her hand over my mother's while Dad watched with that flat expression he wore when he was waiting for something to be over. I drove to Elise's house that afternoon and knocked on her door. She knew immediately why I was there. I could see it in the way her face settled before she had even finished opening the door. I didn't accuse her dramatically. I simply told her I had the photographs and I knew how long it had been going on. She didn't deny it. She tilted her chin slightly and said, "Your mother stopped being a wife long before she got sick." I turned around and walked back to my car. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I understood in that moment what they wanted from me. They wanted me angry and visible and dismissible. They wanted the word unstable to stick. so I stopped giving them anything to point at. I became calm instead. And I noticed, watching Elisa's expression as I walked away, that this frightened her considerably more than my anger would have. My father filed the legal challenge 4 days after the will reading. By the following afternoon, the story moving through the family network was recognizable in shape if not in specifics. The greedy daughter. The manipulative influence on a sick woman. The family being torn apart by someone who had always been difficult. I received 3 fewer calls that week from relatives who usually checked in regularly. 2 old family friends stopped responding to messages. Avery posted something on social media about betrayal and grief and protecting what family leaves behind. She didn't name me. She didn't need to. The worst part was the specific accusation my father had started circulating. That I had abandoned my mother during treatment. I sat in my flat looking at a folder containing 14 months of payment receipts. Every contribution I had made to her treatment costs, organized chronologically. Every transfer, every bank statement, every email confirmation. The distance between what he was saying and what was true was so vast it felt almost unreal. Then my mother's attorney called. "We found another sealed instruction," he said. His voice had the careful quality of someone choosing their pacing deliberately. "Natalie, your mother recorded conversations in her home for nearly a year before she died." He paused. "I think you need to prepare yourself for what's on them." The recordings covered 11 months. My mother had used a small device placed in the living room that she activated during specific conversations. She hadn't recorded everything. The files were targeted, which meant she had known in advance which conversations would matter. I listened to them over 3 evenings, taking breaks when I needed to. My father complaining about the cost of her treatment in terms that had nothing to do with worry and everything to do with impatience. My father telling Avery, in a voice that assumed no one else was listening, that once this was over, everything would go back to normal. My father saying things about my mother's appearance during chemotherapy that I will not write here because they were cruel in a way that deserves no repetition. But the recording that undid me most completely was a quiet one. My mother's voice asking simply, "If I die first, will you at least make sure Natalie feels loved?" A long silence. Then my father, "She made her choice years ago." I stopped the recording. What choice? I had spent my entire adult life wondering what I had supposedly done that put me outside the perimeter of his approval. What original act had I committed that required decades of correction? I went back to the flash drive and found a folder I had initially skipped because the label seemed administrative. Paternity. Walter Mercer was not my biological father. The DNA report my mother had stored on the drive was dated 6 years earlier, which meant she had confirmed this formally while I was still in regular contact with her, while family dinners were still happening, while I was still trying to understand why the distance between me and my father never closed no matter what I did. My biological father had died before my 3rd birthday. Walter had married my mother 2 years later and legally adopted me. The paperwork was in the same folder. And somewhere in the years that followed, the resentment had grown. Not because of anything I had done. Because I was a daily reminder that my mother had loved someone before him. Every time he looked at me he saw evidence of something he could not control or erase. The favoritism. The emotional distance. The way Avery could make a mistake and be forgiven in the same conversation while my mistakes became permanent records. None of it had been about my behavior. It had been about what I represented to him simply by existing. My mother had known. She had spent years trying to soften the damage without addressing the source directly. She had positioned herself between us for so long that the effort had become invisible. And Avery had known too. Which meant she had watched me be treated differently every year of our childhood and said nothing. I called Avery and asked to meet. We sat in a cafe that neither of us had any particular attachment to, which felt appropriate. Neutral ground for a conversation that had no neutral version. She dropped the composed expression about 4 minutes in. "You always acted like the victim," she said, and there was real frustration in it, not just performance. "Dad gave you more attention than you deserved." I looked at her steadily. More attention. The word attention applied to a decade of being made to feel peripheral in my own family. Applied to a college fund that went into her account while I worked doubles. Applied to being locked out of my mother's funeral while she stood behind our father holding tissues. I laid it out for her calmly. Not to win an argument. Just to make sure the reality was stated once without distortion. When I finished, Avery was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that I had not been expecting. Even dying, she still picked you. Not triumphant. Broken. I sat with that. Because underneath everything she had participated in, underneath the lies she had kept and the cruelty she had allowed, Avery sounded like someone who had also been damaged. Just in a different direction. She had been given everything and had somehow still felt second. Our father had done that too. My father's business was not thriving. I found out through my mother's financial records, which were thorough in the way that a careful woman's records are thorough when she has spent years quietly managing damage. His company had been kept alive for the better part of a decade, partly by access to her investment accounts. The arrangement was informal and undocumented, which was exactly how he had wanted it. Without access to her estate, creditors had started making contact within weeks of the will reading. 2 suppliers had already placed the company on cash-only terms. A bank loan was overdue. Everything that had looked like stability from the outside had been built on a structure my mother provided and my father controlled the access to. Now the structure was mine and he couldn't reach it. The humiliation at the funeral hadn't only been cruelty. It had been a calculated move. If he could establish early, loudly, publicly in front of witnesses, that I was unstable and harmful, then anything I said later would arrive already discredited. He had underestimated how thoroughly my mother had prepared for exactly this. One cousin reached out to me quietly that week with a piece of information she had been holding. 2 weeks before my mother died, my father had sat beside her hospital bed with paperwork and asked her to change the will. She had refused. And she had filmed the conversation on the device she kept hidden in her bedside bag. Watching the hospice video was the hardest thing I had done through all of it. My mother was propped up against the hospital pillows looking exhausted in a deep way. The kind that goes past tired and into something more permanent. She was small in the frame. The treatment had taken most of her physical presence by then, and what was left was thin and still. My father stood beside the bed in his coat. He hadn't sat down. The paperwork was in his hand and he kept bringing it forward slightly as he spoke. "You're confused," he kept saying. "It's a simple change. You're not thinking clearly." My mother said no each time. Quietly. Without drama. "Just no." Then he said it. "You're choosing her over your real family." My mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with what I could see was the last reserve of energy she was willing to spend on this particular argument. "Natalie is my family." I had to stop the video for a while after that. When I came back to it, I saw my mother reach over after he left the room and make sure the device was still recording. A small, deliberate gesture. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had spent the last of her strength fighting for me. And he had stood there in his coat and tried to take it anyway. The hospice video moved through the community the way information moves in small towns. Not in a single wave but in a quiet, steady spread. I hadn't released it publicly. I had shared it with the attorney as part of the legal proceedings. But these things travel. By the second week after the will challenge was filed, I noticed the change in how people spoke to me. Not dramatic. Small shift. People who had avoided eye contact now held it. People who had offered the cautious distance of those following the dominant narrative started having second thoughts. My father's business contacts became quieter. 2 men who had known him for years stopped attending the weekly breakfast meeting he had been part of for a decade. And my father blamed me for every inch of it. He found me outside the courthouse one afternoon after a preliminary hearing. He stopped close enough that I had to make a deliberate choice not to step back. "You destroyed this family," he said. I looked at him. Just looked. At the man who had locked me out of my mother's funeral and called me unstable in legal documents and stood at his dying wife's bedside with paperwork asking her to choose him over her own daughter. "No," I said. Mom just stopped protecting you. He had nothing to follow that with. He called me with an offer. Drop the legal proceedings. Transfer control of the foundation. Agree to a revised settlement that gave me the lake house and a reduced share of the investment accounts. Stay quiet about everything I had found. And he said, let it all go. I sat on the phone and let the silence run for a moment. Because the offer told me something important. Not about what he was willing to give. About how frightened he had become. Men who have power don't offer to let things go. They hold. They push. They find new angles. Men who are losing offer deals. Then he said something unexpected. He told me my mother had written one more letter. One he had looked for and never found. He wanted it. His voice when he mentioned it had a particular quality. Not strategic exactly, but urgent in a way that seemed almost personal. He wanted it too badly for it to be only about legal exposure. Whatever was in that letter mattered to him in a way that went beyond the court case. I told him I would think about the offer and ended the call. Then I drove to the lake house and spent 2 hours looking at the furniture, the shelves, the walls. My mother had hidden things in plain sight all her life. She had learned to keep things where someone could find them if they knew her well enough. I checked the sewing table in the corner bedroom. Underneath the drawer, taped flat against the wood, was an envelope. The letter was not what I expected. I had braced for more evidence, more documentation, more proof of things done and hidden and left for me to uncover. Instead, it was a confession. Not about my father. About her. She wrote about the year she discovered he had taken my college fund. She had found out 3 months after it happened, when a bank statement came to the house addressed to Avery that she opened without thinking. She had understood immediately what she was looking at. She had confronted him. He had cried. He told her it was a gambling problem he had managed to resolve. He begged her not to break the family apart. He said Avery didn't know the money had come from me. He promised to put it back. He never put it back. And my mother, who was frightened of what losing the marriage would cost her, and who was trying to hold together a structure she had poured 20 years into, had stayed. She had quietly compensated for his damage year by year, directing resources toward me in ways she hoped I wouldn't question, without ever telling me the truth of why. The final paragraph was the one I read 3 times. I stayed too long trying to keep the peace. Don't make my mistake. The people worth staying for will never ask you to make yourself smaller to protect them. She had spent decades making herself smaller. And in the end, she had made sure I never had to. My mother's charitable foundation held its annual dinner 6 weeks after the will challenge was filed. I had been named in her will as the authority over the foundation's direction and leadership. My father had assumed this was a technicality he could manage around. The board had scheduled the dinner before the legal situation had fully developed, and nobody had formally reorganized the agenda. I wore the dark blue dress my mother had given me 2 birthdays ago. I had never found the right occasion for it. This felt right. Everyone expected me to sit quietly at a corner table and let the evening proceed without incident. Instead, I asked to address the room. I stood at the podium and I spoke for 12 minutes. I did not tell every ugly detail. I spoke about caregiving and the isolation that happens inside families when someone is sick. I spoke about the way people in pain are sometimes surrounded by those who manage the appearance of support without providing the substance of it. I spoke about what my mother had built and why she had built it and who she had built it for. My father stood up and left the room before I finished. He went out through the side exit and I heard the door close behind him. The room stayed. Every person in that room stayed and listened to the end. The foundation board met 3 days after the dinner. My father had spent the intervening time making calls. I knew this because 2 board members mentioned it to me separately, describing his version of events with the careful neutrality of people who wanted me to understand what had been attempted without endorsing it. He had presented himself as the appropriate steward of the foundation. He had implied that my mother's final months had compromised her judgment. He had suggested the board consider whether the legal dispute made my appointment untenable. The vote was unanimous. I was confirmed as permanent director. When the result was announced, Avery was standing near the back of the room. She didn't applaud. But she didn't look away either. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in a very long time. Something that resembled honesty. One board member came to find me afterward. An older woman who had worked with my mother for a decade. She told us you'd turn the pain into something meaningful, she said. She was very specific about that. I managed to thank her without my voice breaking. Because after all the months of evidence and recordings and courtrooms and family cruelty, standing in that room confirmed as the person my mother had trusted, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not victory. Pride. Avery came to my flat at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping. Her hair was loose and she was wearing clothes that didn't match in the way that happens when you get dressed without paying attention, which was not like Avery at all. She stood in my doorway until I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table and cried for a while without saying anything. I made tea and waited. When she finally spoke, the things she told me came out in pieces rather than a continuous account. My father's business debts were more serious than anyone outside his bank knew. The house she had grown up in was closer to foreclosure than the family had admitted. The trust fund my mother had left her was being pressured in ways that Avery was only beginning to understand properly. He had been telling her the legal fight was manageable while privately leaning on her assets to try to cover his exposure. She looked at me across the table. He does it to everyone, she said. Not as an excuse. As an admission. Then she reached into her bag and put a folder on the table. Bank statements. Several months of them. My father's signature authorizing transactions that directly contradicted things he had stated under oath during the proceedings. Transfers, withdrawals, movements of money between accounts during the estate dispute that he had denied making. She had taken them from his home office. The courtroom on the day of the final hearing felt different from the preliminary sessions. My father sat at his table looking like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply run out of the energy to keep his posture up under the weight of it. His attorney was professionally composed, but the particular confidence they had brought to the earlier hearings was gone. Fatima, my attorney, submitted the bank statements Avery had provided alongside the financial records from the estate file. She submitted the hospice recording. She submitted the property transfer documents from the flash drive showing assets moved into Avery's name while my mother was in hospice care. She submitted the timeline of his conduct during the proceedings. The judge reviewed the documents thoroughly. He asked clarifying questions of both legal teams. He took a recess of 20 minutes. When he returned and read the ruling, it was clear and complete. My father's challenge was dismissed entirely. The evidence of misused funds and misrepresentation during proceedings was referred for further review. The estate would proceed as my mother had directed. My father turned in his seat as the ruling was read. He looked at me the way people sometimes look when they are searching for something familiar in a face they think they know. Then, quietly, he said something I had not expected. "I did raise you." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "Mom did. I went to my mother's grave for the first time on a morning in early spring. The service had been held in winter and I had not been there. The ground had settled and fresh grass had started to fill in around the base of the headstone. Someone had left flowers recently, yellow ones, her favorite color, and they were still bright. I knelt down and stayed there for a long time. I told her everything. The vault and the key and the brass engraving. The journals under the floorboard. The recordings. Mrs. Callahan and the photographs. The will reading and my father's face when he heard the lake house was mine. The foundation vote. Avery arriving at my door with the bank statements and crying at my kitchen table. I told her about the courtroom and the ruling. I told her that the lake house smelled exactly the way it always had. For the first time since she died, what I felt sitting beside her was not the jagged, unfinished pain of someone who was denied the chance to say goodbye. It was grief, yes, real grief. But underneath it was something solid. I stood to leave and noticed someone standing at the far edge of the cemetery near the gate. My father. Alone. Coat buttoned high against the cold. No one beside him. He didn't come closer. He didn't raise his hand. He just stood there and watched me walk to my car. I didn't stop. The final package arrived on my birthday. Delivered by the attorney's office. Forwarded as per instructions my mother had left during her last formal appointment there. Inside was a letter. Just a letter. No flash drive, no documents, no evidence of anything. She wrote about the morning I was born. She wrote about what she had hoped for me and what had frightened her and what had surprised her as I grew. She wrote about the specific ways she had watched me become someone she was proud of, listed in small precise detail the way she noted everything. Then the final paragraph. She wrote that she was afraid life would make me hard. That all the things she had tried to protect me from, and the ones she had failed to protect me from, would calcify into bitterness and distance. She wrote that she hoped instead I would let it make me larger. The greatest revenge, she wrote, is building a beautiful life after people spent years convincing you that you deserved less. 6 months after the ruling, the foundation expanded its work to a second region. The lake house became a retreat for families caring for people in the final stages of illness. A place for the people who did the quiet, invisible, necessary work of loving someone through their dying. Avery was rebuilding. Slowly and honestly, the way rebuilding actually happens. My father lost the thing he had spent his entire life protecting. Not money. Not the house. Control. The ability to define the people around him and make those definitions stick. And me. My mother left me her truth, her voice, and a future built on the foundation of everything she had carefully, quietly, deliberately prepared. No one would ever lock me out of it again.